Good morning, everybody. It's so good to see all of you. Wish we were in person, but this will have to do. And one of the benefits of being able to do Nonprofit Cafe over Zoom is the ability to record this. So this will be recorded and available on our website. We do have a YouTube channel that you can view any of our past Nonprofit Cafes, really since the beginning of COVID, that we've recorded. So this will be live next week. So you're welcome to take notes furiously, but it will also be recorded in case you would like to share this with any of your team members. So as we get started, just want to welcome you. I'm Bridget Wilkinson, Executive Director of the One Valley Community Foundation. It's our absolute privilege to be here. Our mission is to connect people who care to causes that matter to build a better community. And this program is one example of that, of creating space for you to come together with your peers, to get to know each other as colleagues, and to learn nonprofit best practices. So just a couple of housekeeping items. If you can just keep yourself muted until obvious times when we want you to dialogue and engage. There'll be a lot of times to interact today. So just be prepared for that. We want you to connect with your colleagues. We really view that the experts are in the room. And so we want you to be sharing and engaging with us today. So if you also want to locate the chat button and add your name and organization to the chat, that's on the lower middle part of your toolbar at the bottom. Mute is on the lower left-hand corner. And then if you can try to keep your video on as much as possible, that would be deeply appreciated. Additionally, we are going to be using breakout rooms quite a bit today. So we encourage you to be brave. I know sometimes that can be hard to meet strangers, meet people that you haven't met before, but I really encourage you to dig in because you're gonna get a lot more out of this session by engaging in that way, and Shannon will speak to that a little bit more. So as we get started, I have the absolute privilege of introducing my friend and colleague, Shannon Stober. She is somebody I deeply respect, love, and adore. And it is our privilege that we get to hear from her today. Every time I hear her speak, I walk away feeling energized, excited. I have clear calls to action. Shannon is just such an expert in this field and donating her time today to share her wisdom. So just want to acknowledge that and our deep appreciation for Shannon. She's the Verve Exchange founder, and she's one of Montana's premier facilitators and trainers, and I can speak to that. Each year, she engages hundreds of individuals from a variety of sectors through high-powered workshops, retreats, speaking engagements, and coaching activities. Shannon is also a skilled strategist and consultant. I can speak to that. She helped us do our strategic plan at the Community Foundation. And she has an extensive background in community building and the development of program theory. And she's also known for her positive energy, her strength of character, and her humor, which you will see today. Today, Shannon's going to be exploring with us key practices in volunteer management during COVID-19, which feels like the wild, wild west. Working with volunteers takes effort under even the most ideal circumstances, and the challenges of managing volunteers amid a pandemic cannot be overstated. So during this session, Shannon will review the key practices of volunteer management and create space for you to identify common struggles and share emerging practices to assist in engaging volunteers during this critical time. So without further ado, I'm going to stop talking because we're not here to hear me. We are here to hear Shannon. So I'm going to pass it off to you, Shannon. Welcome, and we are so grateful that you're here.
Thank you, Bridget. So good morning, everybody. I like to set the bar just high enough so I don't trip over it. So Bridget, thanks for making me stretch today. Really, really excited to be here. So yes, it's true. My name is Shannon Stober. A little bit more about my background. I'm originally from Colorado. I've been in Montana now for about 20 years. Came up here after I graduated college to join this thing called AmeriCorps. Was trying to figure out what one would do with a sociology degree and a minor in women's studies, and it turns out serving your country is one way to go. So I came up, I did a term of service in Bozeman at it used to be called the Blue Iguana Teen Coffee House. Some of you might remember. So I did a term of service there, moved up to Helena, did a second term of service with the Department of Health and Human Services doing youth development work around the state. Following my 2 terms of service, I joined the staff of the Governor's Office of Community Service. So not a lot of people know that there's an actual division in the governor's office committed to promoting volunteerism and civic engagement throughout our great state. So that was a wonderful opportunity for me to work with folks all around the nation to think really strategically about what is volunteerism, how are we using it to meet community needs, as well as getting my chops in facilitation and training. Great experience. We always say small p politics are unavoidable in the workplace, but it turns out big P politics are. So after a few years in the governor's office, I decided to change it up. Went to Missoula, where I oversaw an AmeriCorps program promoting service learning across Montana's higher ed campuses. Then I came back to Bozeman, where I served as the director of programs with the Montana Conservation Corps for about 8 years. That whole time I was side hustling as a trainer and consultant. 5 years ago, I decided to move fully into that role and founded Verve Exchange. So for the last 5 years, I've been working throughout the country and the state, doing a variety of different things that Bridget named. Turns out COVID will put a little bit of a wrench in those plans. So I was doing that, but the Zoom rooms are fine, but that being my sole reality wasn't as fulfilling as I would like for it to be. Also was craving more time at home, less time on the road, and a sense of community where I live. So I actually have recently joined the staff of Eagle Mount. I'm now serving as their senior director of programs. Right on the learning curve. We've all done it, right? 3.5 months in, I figured out where the bathroom is and I know how to use the copy machine. So I just want to be clear that I am here today primarily in my Verve Exchange capacity. I'm still learning so much about Eagle Mount, but I just want to make sure that folks recognize that while I represent both those entities at this time, I'm not speaking on behalf of Eagle Mount today because I'm still really learning about all the great things we do and how we operate. Okay, so I do have a pretty good expertise in the realm of volunteer management and have been known to trade on this subject quite a bit. But with that understood, COVID, all bets are off. There's no such thing as an expertise anymore, right? We're building the plane while we're flying it. We're all trying to figure out what the hell's going on. So as we come together today, my intention is to just briefly remind you of what is the life cycle of a volunteer program? How can we categorize our different efforts? And then give you an opportunity to say, hey, now that I'm thinking about this from more of a 30,000 foot view, where are my key challenges and what have I learned? Like many of you, I know I found a ton of happy little accidents during COVID, been forced to do things in innovative ways that I never would have considered, that I look at now and go, well, that actually kind of works, right? So I'm going to give you an opportunity to share, what are those key learnings? What have you been cooking up that's working well for you that other people might really benefit from hearing? And then we're going to come back together, talk about those key tactics and strategies you've identified, and then we'll identify, well, what are those gaps? What do we still need and what's still missing for us? And how might we be able to work together in identifying solutions and resources? So if you came in here today thinking, hey, I'm going to log on to this Bozeman cafe thing, and they're going to tell me exactly how to solve all these problems with volunteer management during COVID, I need to let you know that is not what's going to happen. But my hope is you get a nugget, right? I hope you walk out of here with a nugget. And to Bridget's comment, the only way that we walk out of here with nuggets is if you guys are willing to actually engage, if you're willing to put it on the court. So when we're using breakout rooms, if you're like one of those people who's like, man, I just wanted to drink some coffee this morning and take some information in, not going to cut it, right? So if that's how you're feeling, feel free to kind of dip off if you're not in the mood or the headspace to engage. But I'd love to invite you to reassess that, show up in those spaces, be vulnerable, be transparent. The more vulnerable and transparent we are about what's really happening in our programs and what we're struggling with, the more likely we are to learn something. Okay, so for the camera, thumbs up. Does this sound good? If we're all on the same page, then we'll go ahead and jump into our shared screen PowerPoint, because it wouldn't be a Zoom if we didn't have some of that. All right, let's pull this sucker up and jump on in. All right, so volunteer management. So I do want to take a few minutes just to go through what is the life cycle of a volunteer program to get us in the headspace to be thinking more globally about what's happening and help us hone in on areas that we could use the most support. So what we have in front of us is a simple visual to help us understand what is the life cycle of volunteer programming. So any volunteer programming should begin with planning, right? We would like to plan our efforts versus just throwing stuff at the wall, although sometimes we convince ourselves we don't have time to. I'm here to remind you that we always do. Once we're done with our planning, that's where we're going to move into our volunteer recruitment activities. Following our recruitment activities, this is where we're going to think critically about selection. Then we're going to think about training our volunteers. Then we move into the robust management activities. And finally, we move into evaluation. So let's go ahead and characterize each of these steps a little bit, and then I'll look to you for you to identify where COVID has impacted you most. All right, so the first step in any program, but specifically in a volunteer program, is going to be the planning. So planning has, from my perspective, three critical components. The first step in planning is thinking critically about the mission and values of your organization. So often we just jump into tactically engaging with our volunteers without taking that step back to look at how our organization approaches volunteerism and what our organization's philosophy is. So these are where we want to dialogue around things like, what is the value of service? Not just to our organization, but to our community, to our world, to the society. Why is it important that we engage people in a service perspective? Where are we aligned with our mission and this notion of the value of service? And how are we using service as a strategy to reach our mission? What are our core values in engaging volunteers? What are those values that are going to drive the way that we engage those folks, recruit them, and treat them? And then finally, what are the various roles and responsibilities within our organization as it relates to volunteerism? I'm a big believer, if you have a strong volunteer strategy in your organization, that's something that should be bulleted in your board member position descriptions, your executive staff, your directors, your coordinators. Everybody should understand how their role relates to the strategy of volunteerism. Once we've gone through that, then we're going to think critically about needs and opportunities. So what are the community needs that we're addressing? What gaps exist? What are our organizational needs and what gaps exist there? How might we utilize volunteerism as a strategy to fill those gaps? Then we're going to ask ourselves, cool, what kind of service do we need? Now, generally speaking, there's 4 types of service that we can engage, right? So we have our type of service would be an indirect service, meaning I'm doing capacity building behind the scenes work for you. Direct service, which means I'm doing direct service, direct delivery of these issues. Entrepreneurial service, which means I'm going to bring somebody in to help innovate and create and leverage their specific gifts and talents. And then we have this notion of mandated service. How can I utilize this notion of restorative justice to bring people in to give them a positive experience while helping them meet some objectives of their own? So once we've identified types of service, then we're going to think about what kinds of volunteers might I need to best meet those. Types of volunteer include episodic volunteers, right? I have a big project. I need 40 strong backs out here to get me done. Recurring volunteers. This is a long-term strategy. This is mentorship. It's based in relationships. So I need folks that are going to come on for the long duration. This is also where we can talk about things like national service and AmeriCorps. Do I need somebody high level who's going to be in here and give me a full year of dedication? So once we've talked about types of service and the types of volunteers that we could utilize to meet the needs, then we're going to simply look at our existing demographics, who is available, where might we have success, set some goals and build some targets. So the first step is always going to be planning. Now, once we've completed our planning activities, we're going to move into recruitment. And recruitment is a pretty meaty subject, but I like to think about it in the following simple terms. So the first step of recruitment is going to be generating my messaging for volunteers. Now, we're not going to be able to deep dive into the psychology of this, but the punchline is when we message volunteers, we want to include the following 3 things in this order. First and foremost, what's in it for you? That's always going to be the thing that gets people's attention. We like to say that volunteerism is this totally selfless act, but the reality is it's not always that selfless. Folks want things out of it. Once I've named what's in it for you, then I'm going to articulate the love and belonging aspect. How will you have a shared identity? What community will you be a part of? What kind of team will you be engaged with? We understand that this is a primary driver for human behavior. And then finally, we list cause, right? So this is about youth development. This is about healthy landscapes. This is about hunger issues. Whatever that is, we're going to end with that cause. So we make our message. Once our message is done, we think about what strategies we can use for recruitment. Again, a lot to be said here, but I'm going to cliff note it for you. When we're thinking about volunteer recruitment, we tend to have 3 strategies we can use. The first one's known as broad-based, okay? Broad-based, these are your flyers. These are your Facebook events. These are the announcements that are going to nobody in particular or nobody in specific. And we recognize that these aren't actually great strategies to recruit volunteer, but they're great communication and outreach strategies to raise awareness of the need. The next one is targeted. So the more specific we are about the type of volunteer we need, the type of service we need performed and what our goals are, the more likely we are to know exactly who we're looking for and be able to go out there and target and find those specific individuals. And then the final one is known as Concentric Circle. And this is really how it's done. Concentric Circle means I know 10 people and I know they're always going to say yes to me. And we think that we're doing volunteer recruitment wrong when we keep leveraging those people and reaching out to those who are in arm's reach. But the reality is that's how it's done. So when we embrace that concentric circle and leverage it and encourage the people in our concentric circle to begin operating through their concentric circles, that's where we actually see the bulk of our volunteer recruitment happening. So once we've got our message and our strategies, then we're just going to implement it. And again, implementation, we want to be thinking critically about our information and technology resources. How easy is it for people to apply? How easy is it for them to get additional information? We're going to look at our outreach and communication strategies. Are we presenting? How are we engaging people? Where are we finding groups that might be aligned? And as always, we also want to be thinking about our roles and responsibilities. We don't want a volunteer to be interested only to get the call to say, I think you should talk to Jim. Wait, no, it's Susan. Oh, no, wait, actually, Susan doesn't work here anymore, right? You want to make sure that those points of contact are really clear. All right, so once we've recruited and we've got some people on the wire, we're going to move into selection. And this is a really important part of volunteer programming. So the first part of selection is going through an interview process. When we interview, there's a couple key things we want to look at. What is that individual's personal interest and motivation? Is it something you can serve? Is it something you can meet? Can you align with that? What's their actual commitment? How can you gauge their commitment? Can you count on them for the long haul? How often are they looking to show up? And then finally, what skills are they bringing to the table? Is it going to be requiring a lot of training on your part, or do they have things you can leverage? Once we've interviewed, that's when we want to move into screening, right? And screening looks different for different organizations. For me, you may want to do reference checks. Let me actually validate that this person has done the things they've done or that their character is good. Many of us are running background checks or working with vulnerable populations that require us to have that firewall in place to make sure we're not putting the people we serve in danger. And if you're looking for volunteers that have specific skills, you might want to affirm that they have licenses and certifications that they say they do, just as a measure of protecting your organization from liabilities. The final step then is matching them up with the service. So you're going to look back at those personal interests and motivations, think about your organizational need, gauge their level of commitment and availability, look at their skills, and get them lined out. Once we've selected, now we're moving into training, and you guys know this. When we think about volunteer training, I like to break that down into 3 key categories. So the first level of training is always going to be our onboarding and orientation. Onboarding and orientation is about me telling you what you need to know today so that you can show up and be successful tomorrow. A good onboarding and orientation is an introduction to the organization, an introduction to the players you'll be working with, showing you the systems and structures that we use. Here's how we report. Here's how we communicate. Here's how we document. Following your onboarding and orientation, that's when you're going to basic training. And basic training is exactly that. I'm training you to the role that I have assigned you to. This is where we're going to utilize tools like do, show, tell, right? We can't just say, read the piece of paper and then you'll be able to do it. No, let me show you how to do it. Show me how you're going to do it. Let's actually engage. This is a good opportunity to have volunteers shadow other volunteers or staff members so they can actually see it and process that over a longer period of time. This is where we want to engage in feedback and correction and provide a good level of coaching so that we know when we walk away and that volunteer is flying solo that they've got it. And then the final piece with volunteer training is just thinking about ongoing training and development, recognizing that oftentimes a reward for volunteers is gaining additional professional skills, personal skills, or having an opportunity to advance and take on more responsibilities within your organization. All right, we've recruited, we've screened, we brought them on, they're trained. Now we're going to get into the bulk of it. This is our simple volunteer management, and I say simple as a joke. So we think about the core pieces of volunteer management. First, we're thinking about that scheduling and communication. When we're thinking about scheduling and communication with our volunteers, I always like to say it needs to be consistent, it needs to be reliable, and it needs to be dependable. Consistent means that I'm reaching out to you regularly. I'm not letting huge gap of time spread between our engagement. So I'm going to communicate with you consistently. Reliably means that I'm going to ensure that I'm using the same mechanism to communicate with you. I know as a volunteer, I've been frustrated. I've had experiences where now it's a Facebook message, but today it was a text, but this one was an email, but then I got an email to a different account, and it's hard for me to track. So when we're communicating with our volunteers, this is the mechanism, this is when you'll hear from me. And that dependability means you will get the information you need from me. You will receive the information that is required of you. You will have the answers to your questions. So anytime we're engaging and communicating with our volunteers, we want it to be consistent, reliable, dependable. The next big component to volunteer management, and this has likely come up for you pretty significantly over the past year, is our risk management. And risk management, to be honest, is something that should be thread throughout all of your activities, but we're plugging it in here just as that direct management activity. So we're thinking about risk management for our volunteers, things that we want to consistently be engaged with. Number one is hazard identification. What are the things that could hurt you as a volunteer? What are the risks to the participants or the beneficiaries we're serving? Where are we creating room for organizational and reputational risk? What types of equipment and property are involved? So we need to think about what are the hazards that are there. And it sounds bad, but you really need to go, okay, worst case scenario. What's the worst case scenario on this? When you've identified your hazards, then you want to circle back and say, how do we mitigate it? Do we mitigate it through equipment? Do we mitigate it through training? Do we mitigate it by not allowing it to be something volunteers do? And we always want to be training and communicating with our volunteers about the hazards, about the mitigations, and about the sideboards of their activities. And then finally, recognition, right? And we all talk a good deal about volunteer recognition, so I won't say much here, but I will just add that volunteer recognition is something that should be happening regularly for all of your people, ongoing, and it should be personalized. So banquets are nice, lunches are nice, but we have to recognize that each and every one of us receives recognition in a very different way. Now, I'm one of those people, public recognition is fine. If you want to throw me a parade, I am good with that, right? But there are other people who would be absolutely horrified, right? There are people who are like, do not ever recognize me in front of other people. So it's a simple conversation, understanding what preferences are and recognizing that that should be a key practice and ongoing practice that you're doing with your volunteers all the time, not just something you're doing annually. The final piece of a volunteer program is evaluation, and our evaluation should have 3 different components. So the first one is volunteer assessments. How was your experience? Did you feel well communicated with? Did you feel like we were giving you good support? Did you feel like your efforts were meaningful? Just tell me more about your experience. And then you really want to specifically ask too, did we train you? Was communication clear? Did we ask you to do something that felt unsafe? Anything we can learn about that individual's experience is going to be really, really important for the organization. Next, we want to come back and actually assess the program. I see a lot of people assess volunteers, but not step back to say, well, how is our programmatic strategy? So we're going to go back to where we started. What were the metrics? What were the targets? What were the goals? What did we hit? Where did we miss? And then that final piece is generating all of this into a reporting format where we're going to include narrative and color that out by some of these specific pieces of feedback. Identify what was the impact? What are the strengths of our volunteer program? Where do we have room to improve? And that leads us back to understanding why this is actually a cycle, because that evaluation should then lead right back into your planning. So this is what it looks like to run a volunteer program. It's cyclical, but those steps are sequenced for a reason. Okay, so now that we've taken a little bit of time to look at that, I want to give you an opportunity to think about where COVID has impacted you most. So we're going to do a poll. I'm launching the poll. So I would love for each of you to identify of these areas of your volunteer program, where has COVID impacted you most? Your planning, your recruitment, selection, the training, management, and evaluation. So we'll wait for those to come in and we'll see what we learn from that, and then we'll get ready to go into our first breakout. Got about half of you in there. I can see how many people have voted. I assume the rest of you are just thinking super critically. All right. Give it one more second here, and then we'll see what we've got. Okay. So those direct management activities, those are the ones that are coming out ahead. No major surprises there. So when we're thinking about those management activities, we're thinking about the communication, we're thinking about the risk management, we're thinking about recognition. So it sounds like that's the area that probably is hitting us most. Also seeing the training piece, you guys will have opportunity to talk more about this in small groups, but I would imagine likely a large part of that is, social distancing, proximity, and ability to gather, and how those things restrict our ability to train in ways that we're used to. And then planning, right? Because it's like, that the plan is the joke. You're like all lined out and everything's going great, and then you get a pandemic, right? So these things seem about right. I see that there's some other folks who identified other areas, but for our purposes today, we want to focus in on what the group seems to be moving towards. So let's go ahead and say that our items that we're going to dialogue around today are going to be focused on management and training, and then maybe coming back to planning. Although one thing I've learned is planning during the time of COVID can be a little bit of a fruitless effort. So we're going to focus today on training and management. Okay, so what we're going to do to start off, we're going to put you into small groups. And in your small groups, I want for you to say, hey, here's the one I identified. And if you'd like to share some specificity around the management and training components that are challenging you, that would be wonderful. And in those small groups, share, here's some things that are working or things that we're considering, and let's just see what we can learn from each other. So you'll be in there for a good bit of time, probably 10, 12 minutes. And then we're going to come back. We'll have a shared whiteboard for you to share the strategies and tactics. We'll chew on that a bit, and we'll go to our next breakout group. So Bridget's going to go ahead and throw you into your breakout group format, and we will see you in a little while. Have fun, engage, be nice. So welcome
Guys,
back, everybody. Yeah, Cameron, go ahead.
Well, I'm just so, how did I come into that? What happened to my world here? How did I come in? I was with Anna Greenberg, and all of a sudden did I just go wandering in the clouds and I wound up here?
So you came out of your Zoom room. So what happens when you get dismissed from your Zoom room? Yeah, okay. So there's two things that'll happen. You'll get a notice saying your Zoom room will close at a certain amount of time, and then it'll automatically kick you out. But not uncommon for people to see that and click it and not realize that it's going to shoot you straight over here. So that's probably what happened.
I see. Okay.
All right.
Sorry.
Welcome back, everyone. Hopefully you were able to share a little bit about the challenges your organization has faced. And identify or share some practices that you might be playing with or have implemented that are helping to meet those challenges. So we're going to get real crazy here with the Zoom room. And folks who have not done this before, what we're going to do is a shared whiteboard. So in a moment, I'm going to share my screen and it will be a whiteboard. And at the top of that screen, if you drop the menu, you'll see a button that says annotate. And on that annotate button, you can hit text. So let's go ahead and start there. Some of you have done this, but a lot of people haven't. So again, at the top of your screen, you should have a drop-down menu that gives you an option to annotate. And then on that, we're clicking text. There's going to have all kinds of options, but we'll stick with text. So what I'm asking you to do now is to click that text box to activate it. And then you're going to click anywhere on the whiteboard. And on that, I'd like for you to type in, here are the challenges we identified, and or here are some of the strategies that we're using. So the goal is to give all of you an opportunity to upload some of the key points from that conversation so we can look at it collectively, see if there's any themes and patterns, and make sure we have a document that we can pass along with you so that you can look back on some of these practices. I've got a chat. Yes, Bridget is here to help you. And it usually takes a minute or two for folks to get activated and get their thoughts typed out. I can see your little hands, whether they're moving or not, so I engage you. All right, how do we get people to want to show up in person during COVID? Less one-on-one time training with volunteers. Nothing for volunteers to do. In-person volunteers are essential, but more challenging in times of C-19. Ooh, volunteers unwilling to follow the restrictions. Let's get some more. We've got some strategies and I'll start organizing these a little bit if I can. Oh, nope, I can't. How to keep folks engaged when you're essentially closed. Yeah. Now, sometimes we'll inadvertently put a text box on top of somebody else's. So we have that in the upper right-hand corner. So if that was you, you should be able to click that box and slide it so we can see what you contributed. Again, not having the group training, less volunteers. Yes, short guide included with an online event confirmation emails. High risk population, absolutely, Anna, that's a big one for you. Being transparent and honest. Good. Let's keep going. We'll get a few more on here and then we'll debrief this out a bit and see what folks have to share. The advisory versus the fiduciary, the volunteers are finding impactful things for them to engage on and advise. Great. Give it just one more minute for folks to contribute something on there if they would like to. And I'm making some notes on my end, and then we'll open it up to a little bit of discussion before we go back into our next breakout group. Okay. So I am going to save this. We'll get more. Okay. We'll save that and we'll pull this up again too if there's folks that are still out there. I'm going to give it one more minute since one just popped on. Okay. So we'll have that saved and we can share it with you, but it does look like we had some pretty central themes emerging, right? So one of the first themes was around the training strategies. So if we're not able to be in person and we're doing it one-on-one, it's taking more time. So there's a lot about just the actual delivery of training that seems to be a primary issue that we're dealing with. And then we have just volunteer behavior, right? So they're not following the restrictions, right? They're not doing the things that we ask them to. How are we messaging it? How are we holding accountability in place? We have training, we have the restrictions. Then we have this piece around how to keep volunteers engaged while we are essentially not operating. So what are those tools and strategies that we can play with for volunteer engagement for folks? There's another one on there. Hold on one second. So we had the training, we had the restrictions, risk management, we had volunteer engagement, and then just a lower volunteer pool, right? So having fewer people unwilling to volunteer and asking them to shoulder a lot. Did anybody feel like there was a theme on there that I haven't identified? And feel free to unmute yourselves if you'd like. Are there any themes that I did not identify?
Shannon, one thing that I've run into with volunteers and interns at Haven is that a big part, I feel like, of what draws our volunteers is like being in person with participants and finding that really meaningful. And so it feels like having fewer in-person interactions with our service population leads to a less meaningful experience overall, if there's a disconnect there.
Absolutely. Okay, so just that lack of in-person, and I know that a lot of people are seeing that and struggling with that as well. So I think that's not an uncommon one, Okay, so we had some strategies that got put up there, but now that we've honed in on a couple of these core things, what I'd like to do is to have you really engage in thinking about strategies and solutions around some of these core issues. So we know we all have lots of issues and we could get really stuck in the mud on that, but as a collective group, we're looking for these larger, big picture items, okay? So we have the training piece. We have the getting volunteer behavior on board, right? Like really, you got to do these restrictions. Turns out I really need you to wear that mask. And then we have how can we make sure that we're practicing our recognition activities for folks? And then what can we do to deal with the lower number of in-person, lower number of volunteers willing to engage in the lower number of in-person visits. So I'm going to go ahead and type this in the chat, but we're going to divide you up into a different group so you have an opportunity to chat a little bit more. And we're specifically looking for solution strategies, practices that you have used. So again, we're looking at training issues, solutions, ways that we can motivate volunteers to adhere to our guidelines and the restrictions, how we might be able to engage our volunteers, and then finally thinking about how we can support the smaller number of volunteers in taking on more work. So, Bridget, are you ready to fire people into groups? Runs. So I had a chance to hop into most of those breakout groups and get a sense of what folks were talking about. And again, I think it's a matter of reminding ourselves of what's working, right? And sharing the things that are working and that are making this feel a little bit less burdensome for all of us. Unsurprisingly, our numbers have smalled a little bit, which will happen when you have people going into breakout groups a lot in the morning. But the good news is that's an opportunity for us to share a little bit more intimately. So what I'd like to do is just do a quick once around and give you an opportunity to say, hey, here's a practice or here's something we talked about that I'd really, really like to share with all of you. So Claire, I'm just letting you know you're the next person to me in the box. And so that means you're going to fire us off. And again, let's not be overly robust with our comments, but make sure we're sharing fully. Claire, what do you got? What's the positive twists?
I have to confess, I stepped out of the meeting, and that's why I was back first.
All right, Claire, well, you hang out right there. We're going to start with Emma, and then you'll have time to think something up by the time we come back to you. Thank you for your confession.
So we talked about how people are kind of losing the meaningful aspect of their volunteering. We really thought like having our volunteers share a quote that brightened your week so that we can share it with our participants and brighten theirs. So really bring them back to helping our participants feel better in this time of isolation.
I really like that too, because you're steering them towards inspiration, right? So in the act of searching for a quote, you're looking for something that sparks you and makes you feel a little bit more alive, and then having that opportunity to pass that along. Great. Thank you, Emma. Anna.
We talked about just finding ways that they can engage from home and either complete a project or plan something, even if it's not a huge project, but just to keep them engaged so that when we do open, they can continue to feel like they're a part of the organization and the mission.
Love it. And we've done similar things. And one thing I didn't mention is that I also serve as the volunteer coordinator for the Red Pants Music Festival. And so have been in the heat of this with you, of having this great volunteer body who feels unconnected and unengaged right now. And so we've done all kinds of little things of like, hey, would you guys like look over this newsletter story? Tell us what you think about it, right? Or like little things that we know we don't actually need, but it's a great way for them to feel like they're involved and engaging and attached to the mission and content. So it is a little bit, you know, oftentimes might be a little bit more work for us to create those opportunities, but a great strategy for long-term retention. Thanks, Anna. Miss Deb, RSVP, Deb Downs.
One thing, my volunteers are in their 70s and 80s, and they are all kind of stagnant at home right now. So I'm only keeping in touch with them over the phone, and I'm trying to encourage them to keep in touch with each other. Being in Livingston, it's a small town. A lot of them know each other already and have for decades. So I try to get them to communicate with each other more.
I love it. Thank you, Deb. And if folks have done any engagement with the senior core population, you likely know that this is an army of volunteers and that volunteer management with this group is pretty nuanced. Deb, what I really like about what you're saying is that I think it helps us understand that in times like these, we might need to shift our lens to thinking about our volunteers as beneficiaries as well. Right. And Tierney, this goes back to Tierney's comment if she's still here, but this notion of people are coming and are drawn to that role in our mission because it serves them in some capacity. And in the absence of being able to provide that, what else can we do? Right. And it's just a little pivot of thinking. We think about volunteers often as inputs to our work. And don't necessarily think about how we need to think about them as an outcome of our work as well. So have fun talking on the phone. Maybe you could get some of these other volunteers that have nothing to do to call your senior volunteers too. I mean, right? I think there's some feel good magic that could happen there. Kate. Hey, Kate, you actually are up.
Awesome. I was just checking because I was like, you could have your senior volunteers call each other and keep each other company.
Yeah.
So I was in the group with Emma where we were talking similar to what Anna said, just creativity, like what the population you serve, what can your volunteers do given restrictions that's meaningful and interesting, whether it's reviewing a newsletter or pulling quotes together into something you're going to offer survivors or whatever the situation is. So that's already been covered pretty thoroughly. I think other solutions we discussed, appreciation, just really upping that thread in our work for people.
Yeah.
And then when there are hardships and people aren't following the rules, just really treating it less as an annoyance and more as an opportunity to train volunteer supervisors and ourselves to handle challenging situations.
Yeah.
A lot of us haven't had to do that, and we don't have those skills. We're not good at it.
Yeah. No, I appreciate that. And I think folks in this sector are wired to deliver and to engage and to have access to as many people as they can. Like, that's just our wiring. And so to be in this position where it's literally like, you cannot do that, we're asking people in many ways to operate against instinct. And so to see it as an opportunity to say, okay, you know, from my background, I would say, how can we solve this structurally? The majority of conflict or chaos that we engage with is because of poor structure or lack of structure. And that's similar to what you're saying, Kate, is like, great, what does this tell us about our organization and about the structures and systems and processes that we can use and staff coaching we might need that will give us a greater toolkit moving forward. So thank you for those. Carrie Hansen.
Good morning, everybody.
Morning.
Great to see you. One of the things that I just said, I don't know that I'm definitely here to learn. This is an area that I have struggled with in COVID for sure. I work at the MSU Alumni Foundation and lead the engagement team there, which is really fun work. We've done some really great work with engagement, but I think we're missing the boat a little bit on our volunteers. I've done a lot of research in the industry of higher education, but I think a lot of it can relate to you guys as well. And that what volunteers hope for, whether it's COVID or not, but maybe especially so, is a shorter commitment where they can get a check mark and a fulfillment at the end. And I'm struggling with finding those things, but I've already written down a couple of ideas. And while this didn't surface in my 2 great breakout rooms, one of the things that I thought of is, we probably could do a document or strategic review of some of those things, like those paper things, which that is not fun, but there are some people on our board who have that skill and would like to do that. And it's like, can we take February for document review and get a check mark at the end of February? What are those little task forces maybe where some of those tasks can be done at home? I really liked the idea on the idea board of, getting your board to submit a photo about what they've been doing or a quote or a recipe or something. Again, I have an advisory board, not a fiduciary board. So it's been really difficult. So I'm approaching this with a board lens, and I have gotten some ideas. I appreciate that. We have a lot of other volunteers, certainly, who volunteer in other ways, and it is purposeful and kind of in a tight timeline, and I think that's something to keep in mind.
I love it, Carrie. And in my mind, that connects to what Kate's saying in terms of how do we look at this as that opportunity for capacity building, right? And looking at our infrastructure and our systems and tools. And I really also like what you're adding. And, accomplishment can be very motivating for people. And so eat an elephant one bite at a time, right? It's like, hey, by the end of February, we'll have this document finished. And those little things can really help maintain momentum, especially when we're in times like these. Thank you. All right. I'm going to get it wrong. Is it Marielle? Marielle. Okay. I wasn't too far off. Marielle, what came to the top for you?
So I was actually in the group with Carrie as well. And one thing that I shared from my experience with Windhorse, as far as like compliance goes and volunteers not necessarily wanting to follow the restrictions, is just making sure you set the tone and set expectations early. And, with the caveat that our program is outdoors. And so it's easier, like just by nature of what we do, it is easier for people to be socially distant and safe. But we said before we even started with our programming in 2020, like all participants, when they show up, are going to have their temperature taken, and all participants are going to fill out this form, and all participants are going to wear a mask at all times. And so by sort of setting that tone and saying, this is what is required for us to be able to operate, gave people, like, you know, if that wasn't something that they were willing to do, they didn't have to sign up to volunteer. And so we were very fortunate to not have any incidents with, like, you know, a volunteer being non-compliant or anything like that. But having, like, we had written up protocol from day one. So it's like, yeah, if you had an exposure outside of the volunteer program, you know that you have to let us know, and we have to go find a substitute for you because you're not, like, coming near our staff and our kids.
Totally.
So yeah, just making sure that you set that tone and manage expectations early, rather than coming at it later being like, oh, we really wanted you to wear a mask. So.
Right. Yeah. And I think, and that came out in one of the groups I popped in on, but I think it's just to be clear in black and white about those things. Right. And when we're clear in black and white, we're not adding a sort of, sometimes maybe, we're not making exceptions. It makes it a whole lot easier just to say, this is the practice. It's okay if you don't want to opt in. It's never personal. It's just the structure. So yep. Thank you. Naomi, you had some fun stuff to share. Yes. Clear as kind.
Yeah. So in my group, we were talking about kind of the benefits of being able to do trainings virtually. I work with the Advocate Network here at the Alumni Foundation, and a lot of our advocates are all across the state, in Eastern Montana and Havre, you know, here in Bozeman, of course, but just everywhere. And, you know, in previous years with our volunteer tracking, we would actually get a lot of hours that was just driving time. So with being able to do training virtually, we still were able to get high profile people and quality training in. But it's a more efficient way of, you know, getting that information out there to our volunteers to prepare them for, you know, the session that's going on right now.
Love it. Yeah. Right. So it's like, as much as we can talk about how Zoom is a little bit of a pain, there are those advantages. So thanks. Kelton, what about you, sir?
So we talked about compliance with the mask also in our group, and yeah, we had some of the same discussion where we had clear messaging or rules out there, but we had some people that, instead of taking a negative approach of you're not wearing the mask, we had some agents go around and they called, like, you got caught wearing a mask, and so then they would give like a coupon or a candy bar or something. So try to make it more of a positive than a negative, and reward the positive behavior instead of always focusing on the people that weren't following the rules.
I love it. I love it. I need to be better about that. At Eagle Mount now, I'm called the COVID cop. They're like, oh, here comes the COVID cop. So I need to start carrying candy bars or something. Thanks, Kelton. Dara, what about you? What would you add?
One thing that came up with my group, I was talking to Peggy and Cameron. Peggy's with the UU Church and Cameron's with Befrienders. And it sounded like partnerships was a strong way that we found some help. If we couldn't do something with our organization, working with another organization to get that kind of help that maybe we wouldn't have needed before COVID. Something else that I thought of that might be valuable that we've at the food bank adopted, because a lot of our volunteers are at risk and have decided to stop coming. So we have had like Zoom calls with them every few months or so. Like we have like the Monday crew and the Wednesday crew. And so we'll do like a Zoom call with the Monday crew. And it's just a good way for them to interact and catch up with us. Takes like 40 minutes, really small amount of time on our end, and they all feel really great coming out of it.
I love it. I know. I can't tell you how many times I've reluctantly drug my feet to some Zoom call that was set up for something like that. And I'm like, oh man. And then by the time I get off, I'm like, that was really nice. You know? So it's like just remembering that it can be satisfying. Thanks. Yep. Gotcha, Bridget. Glenda, let's hear from you. We'll do this last roll and then we'll make sure we don't have Q&A since likely stuff has been hit.
I was in the group with Kelton, so we were talking about motivating adherence to the requirements. And my only addition to what he said would be that I've just really tried to reinforce to my volunteers that adherence doesn't just affect them and the family that they're working with, but it also is a reflection on our program as a whole. And so, I think for the most part, they've all taken that to heart, that, their choices affect a much broader base of people, and maintaining the integrity of the program through this is important as well.
Love it. Yeah. You're riding for the brand, right? Like you're riding for the brand. Feels like a personal decision, but in fact it is, but it isn't. You can personally decide to not engage, but you can't make that personal decision underneath of our brand, which is just an unfortunate truth. Cool. All right, let's see. We'll do one more. Karina, do you have anything to share? I know we've heard a little bit from you, but anything that hasn't been covered?
I think just mostly that we've been able to do weekly check-ins with our volunteers, which I feel like has been really helpful in engaging and supporting them in doing the work of providing direct services to survivors. So I think that's really helped build our confidence in the advocacy that they're providing, and also has offered the opportunity for us to get to know them a little bit better.
Yeah, you bet. Love it. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
So it sounds like we've got some good themes, right? So when we're thinking about what are those things that are sustaining us, and how do we start looking at this through that lens of opportunity, really thinking critically about how we're communicating and engaging with our volunteers, keeping them active in our mission in ways that maybe feel non-traditional, but at least help them feel like they're still meeting their personal needs with that. Looking at some of our volunteers through that lens of a beneficiary, and trying to design things towards them as a gesture of retention. Sounds like we've got some good information here too around this, how do we maintain our standards and safety precautions, being clear, being kind, catching people when they're doing the right thing. All of those are wonderful practices. And then again, looking at how are we recognizing this time as an opportunity to go through that whole planning process for our programs and build capacity, and look at how we have strengths that can be developed while we're not necessarily doing the work that we normally do on the ground. So hopefully this has felt meaningful for you. Like I said, there's no clear answer. The best we can do is come together and just dialogue around it and share openly and see what the universe is willing to deliver us on that day. I know Bridget likes to leave room for Q&A, so I'm going to pass it over to her to facilitate that a little bit.
Yeah, Shannon, thank you so much. I just want to acknowledge her heroic effort, and I learned a lot today from you all and from Shannon, so thank you. So we only have a few minutes left. We always want to be respectful of your time and end on time. If you have a question, feel free and just unmute yourself and fire away. So we'll try to just end on time, but I think we have time for a handful of questions. So is there anyone that wants to be brave and ask a follow-up question for Shannon?
Shannon, I have a question about planning.
Sure.
We haven't really ever done a full plan of how to bring in new volunteers or orientate them or do like a whole training thing. Do you have any resources that might be helpful to kind of kick off that sort of like a volunteer planning, training, management, all kind of bundle?
Yeah, I do. I have a lot of resources. So, and I can send these to Bridget afterwards and she can send those out. So what I have that could be helpful is I have the worksheets that I use for my trainings that'll ask a couple central questions that I think will help kick you off. And then I have a separate packet of just resources that are like, hey, here's what should be in a manual. Here's what you should put in a position description. Here's some things that you want to include in your training activities. And then I actually have a couple PDF versions, I think a Word version of some volunteer manual samples. So I think if you're looking at that, it will start kind of giving you the pieces to understand how to put this together as a program. So I'll share those with Bridget and she can, share those with anybody here who is looking for resources. And then you're welcome, Emma, to reach out to me directly if you have specific questions or things I can help guide you on.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that.
You bet. And that's how it normally happens, right? Like we get into it and we're doing the mission and we're doing volunteerism and it's like, oh, like, okay, we should probably take a step back. So glad that you're recognizing it.
Thanks.
I had a quick question. When you're working with a group of people who are resistant to formalizing a volunteer program or thinking of it that way or managing it, they find the time involved with creating position descriptions and really defining what you're doing, it's just not their thing and they don't feel like it's a priority. What are the ways you have convinced and cajoled and helped people see it differently?
Kick up. No, I'm just kidding. I don't do physical violence. So there's two tools, Kate, that really I feel like help me. So, and I'm going to cliff note this for you, but one of the models I work with all the time is known as the waterline model. And it's essentially the product of research done in the 70s to identify the sources of workplace conflict. The punchline of this model is that structure leads conflict. So 80% of the time that we're experiencing conflict at work, which is defined as disharmony and task disruption, it's because something is unclear in the structure. So the roles and responsibilities, reporting, metrics, all that creates structure. So what we're doing actually when we create that structure is making it easier for people to engage with us, making it more effortless, giving them the clarity they need. So that structure and what you're talking about, those are our friends who we like to call inventives, who are just like, it'll figure it out, and that's how they live life. And the rest of us are like, cause I'm going to figure it out. Right. So those folks tend, for them, that feels very confining. So the art is to help them understand that we can build the plane while we're flying it here, but somebody actually needs to work on the gauges, right? So that would be the piece, is in looking at that waterline model and recognizing the role structure plays, and that it's actually a kind thing, as Bridget said, makes our work easier, makes it easier for people to engage, eliminates their frustration, and really just bolsters our mission. So yeah, and just make sure they understand that what they're asserting is a personal preference, and that those tools being created does not take away their preference. It meets the needs of others.
And you mentioned there were two things and you only said the waterline model.
What did I say? Okay, so there's I think I would say too, the personal preference piece, honestly, right? Recognizing that resistance towards structure is a personal preference, and that people that have that personal preference think sometimes that it's actually a higher value. It's not, it's just a preference.
Team, we have time for one more question. If anybody else has a question they'd like to ask Shannon.
I feel like after this call, I'm going to have 100 questions and I just need to marinate. So just putting that out there.
Yeah. And please feel free to contact me, folks. When I say that, I mean it. I'm happy to share resources, and would be delighted if you've got some central questions or are looking for a starting point on some of this stuff. I'm more than happy to help.
Well, I think on that note, I think we'll wrap up for today. I just want to thank everybody again for your vulnerability, showing up, engaging. There was a lot of engagement today, and that can be really hard on a Friday. This will be recorded and posted on our website, most likely early next week. So feel free, come back to this video as often as you need. And just a final thank you to Shannon for her leadership and her expertise that she's so generously donated to all of us today. So thank you so much for joining us for our Nonprofit Cafe for January, kicking off our 2021 calendar. So thank you so much, and we will see you next time. We'll see you in February. Thanks, team.
Bye, folks. Take care. Oh, the music's back.
Yeah.